He stood in line like any other tired customer, rain dripping from his coat, waiting for a takeout pizza at the diner he built with his own hands. No one recognized him, but when two young cashiers laughed and whispered about charging old folks extra, he froze, not because it was rude, because it broke a promise he once made to a woman he loved. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. The rain in Dayton wasn't heavy, but it had the kind of persistence that found its way through collars and cuffs, soaking you slow and steady, like time itself. Walter Jennings didn't seem to mind. He walked with a slight limp, the kind that told stories no one asked about anymore, hands deep in the pockets of his old army jacket. The streets were quieter than usual, the wet sidewalks reflecting neon signs that flickered half-heartedly in the early evening. He passed a barbershop that hadn't changed its prices in years and a laundromat with a broken vending machine. Then came the diner, the one with the green awning and the chipped red door, tucked just off the main road like a secret still trying to be remembered. Riverside Diner, his diner, though these days, it didn't quite feel like his. Walter paused before stepping in. He hadn't been here in nearly 2 weeks, not since his doctor warned him about his blood pressure. But truth be told, it wasn't the salt that kept him away. It was the way the place had started to feel like someone else's dream. Inside, the warmth and smells hit him all at once. Coffee too long on the burner, bacon grease, fryer oil, and something faintly sweet, maybe cinnamon rolls from earlier in the day. He kept his hat low, pulled up the collar of his coat, and walked past the counter without a word. The younger staff didn't recognize him. That was the point. He took a seat in the far corner booth, the one with the cracked vinyl that he never got around to fixing. It gave him a view of the front counter, but not too obviously. He didn't want to be noticed. Not tonight. The girl behind the register, Megan, he remembered, was laughing with another young woman, Tori. They were hunched close together, sharing something on a phone screen, giggling. Walter didn't look directly at them, but sound carries differently in a place like that, especially when you've spent decades learning how to listen. Old guy from table 7? Megan whispered, not whispering low enough. Didn't even notice I charged him for 2 sides of fries. That's an extra $4 right there. Tori giggled. Girl, they don't see anything. Add an extra coffee, and it's ours. They're too busy trying to remember their own names. Walter's hand tightened around his paper coffee cup. The lid creaked slightly under the pressure. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He just stared at the specials board on the wall, still written in the faded blue marker that Evelyn used to love. Only now, above it, someone had pinned a bright, laminated poster for a national soda brand, a corporate promotion that offered a free drink with every combo meal. The board Evelyn had made years ago still held her handwriting. Just one line that remained, weathered but intact. We serve with heart, not just hands. He stared at it longer than he meant to. The letters had smudged over time, but the meaning hadn't. When his order number was finally called, Walter stood slowly, his knees protesting with the familiar ache of too many winters. He didn't look at Megan or Tori as he passed them, didn't meet their eyes. He just took the pizza box and nodded once, more to himself than anyone else. Outside, the rain hadn't let up. He walked back into it, his coat pulling at his shoulders with the weight of more than just water. The box was warm in his hands, but his chest felt cold. Not angry, not yet, but something quieter, something that made his jaw tighten and his heart sit heavy. As he crossed the street, not a single person inside the diner looked up. Not one paused to wonder who he'd been, or what he might have overheard. But Walter knew. And tonight, what was taken wasn't just $4 from a stranger. It was trust. And for a place like Riverside, that meant more than any ledger could track. The rain had let up by the time Walter made it home, but he hardly noticed. His boots left a trail of damp prints across the worn linoleum of his kitchen floor. The house was still, the kind of still that clung to the edges of memory. Nothing out of place. Everything exactly where Evelyn had left it, years ago. Before the hospital visits. Before the diagnosis. Before the quiet that followed. The clock above the stove ticked with a steady rhythm, just like it always had. but tonight it seemed to echo louder, as if reminding him that time wasn't the same as peace. He slipped off his coat, draped it over the back of the chair, and stood for a long moment at the edge of the kitchen counter. Then, almost without thinking, he walked to the hallway, opened the tall oak cabinet, and reached for the small wooden frame tucked behind a stack of old recipe books. Evelyn looked out at him from behind glass that had begun to fog at the corners, still wearing that white apron with the crooked stitching. Her smile was soft, lips parted mid-laugh, one hand holding a menu they had written together, the other resting on his arm like a promise. He sat down slowly, the picture in both hands. His thumbs traced the edge of the frame. He could still hear her voice, that gentle conviction beneath her teasing tone. "I don't want this place to just feed people," she had told him the night before they opened Riverside. "I wanted to see them. I want people to come in and feel safe. Not judged, not looked down on, just seen." Back then, they had nothing but a handful of folding chairs, a borrowed griddle, and a heart full of conviction. Evelyn had called it a sanctuary. He'd called it a fresh start. But now it felt like something had been broken, quietly and with precision, so subtly that no one noticed until the trust had already bled out. Walter sat at the table for over an hour, the photograph propped against his coffee mug. He didn't move, didn't cry. That wasn't his way. But there was something inside him, tight and unfamiliar, settling in his chest like a stone that wouldn't pass. The next morning came with a pale sunrise and the kind of cold that crept into bones. Walter unlocked the diner door just after 5. The front lights flickered to life like an old habit. He moved through the place methodically, wiping down counters, refilling sugar jars, adjusting salt shakers that were already full. But this time, his hands lingered. His eyes scanned the small details. The credit card logs, the receipt drawer, the paper inventory lists he hadn't looked at since last winter. There were things he hadn't noticed before. Voided items without explanation, duplicate charges, tips that didn't line up with regular customers, little red flags that didn't scream but whispered. Steadily, by 6, the sun had edged up over the hills, casting pale light across the tile floor. Walter was still behind the counter when Lisa walked in, hair pulled back, face flushed from the cold. She paused when she saw him. "Didn't expect you here this early," she said, setting her bag down gently. Walter didn't look up from the paper in front of him. "I needed to remember why I opened this place." She didn't reply right away, just nodded, slowly, like she understood more than she let on. Lisa had been with them since the beginning, had washed dishes beside Evelyn on opening day, had filled in shifts when Evelyn got sick, had held Walter's hand at the funeral and said nothing, just squeezed twice. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the overhead lights and the rustling of morning wind against the front door. Then Walter straightened, folded the list of suspicious transactions, slid it into his shirt pocket. At 7:05 a.m., he reached for the phone on the wall, dialed the staff group line, and left a message in that calm, low voice of his, one that carried more weight because it didn't rise or shake. "All staff, please report for a meeting first thing Monday morning. Mandatory." He hung up without saying more. Outside, traffic had started to pick up. The world moved on like it always did. But inside that diner, something had shifted. This time, Walter wasn't going to wait for the silence to speak for him. Monday morning came cold and overcast, the kind of gray that sank into the bones before noon. The diner's front windows had already begun to fog as the staff trickled in one by one. Shoulders hunched, collars pulled high. They knew something was different. The kind of different that didn't come with shouting or slammed doors, just a message left on the phone line and Walter Jennings' name at the end of it. The meeting was held in the back room where they stored old menus, aprons, and bulk supplies of paper towels. Normally, the space smelled faintly of lemons and cardboard. Today, it smelled like anticipation, dry and heavy. Walter stood by the old chalkboard they used to track shifts. He didn't lean on it or pace or raise his voice. He simply stood, hands folded in front of him, the way he used to stand during roll call back in the service. Lisa poured coffee quietly, careful not to let the spoon clink too loudly. Sammy, the cook, adjusted the string of his apron twice before settling beside the sink. Ben, barely out of high school, kept his head down like a kid called to the principal's office. Walter let the silence stretch. He wanted them to feel it, the weight of it, not as punishment, but as space. Space for truth, space for conscience, if anyone still had the nerve to use it. "I won't name names," he said finally, voice even but unmistakably firm. "But I need to ask, has anyone seen behavior here that doesn't belong? Dishonesty, small theft, anything that goes against what this place was built on." No one moved. Tori fiddled with the sleeves of her sweatshirt. Megan sat stiffly beside her, lips pursed, eyes forward. When Tori's hand started to rise, just a few inches off her lap, Megan reached over gently and pressed it down again. It wasn't harsh. It was practiced. Walter's gaze swept over the room, not accusatory but steady, searching. "I believed this was a place where people could eat with dignity," he said, softer now. "I believed it because Evelyn believed it, and I didn't think we needed rules taped to every wall to make that true." Sammy's eyes darted away. Ben shifted in his chair. The scrape of a single shoe across the linoleum cut through the silence like a bell. Walter let his words hang, then added, "I won't investigate, I won't interrogate, but I won't ignore it either." He didn't wait for someone to respond. There was nothing more to say. Not yet. He left the room the way he entered, calmly, quietly, like a man who already knew the answer but wanted to see if anyone else had the courage to speak it out loud. That evening, the diner was quieter than usual. The dinner rush came and went, but Walter remained in the back storage room, the door slightly ajar. A single desk lamp cast a soft glow over the scattered receipts and register tapes. He worked methodically, his eyes scanning each line, fingers smoothing out creases as he tallied numbers in his head. His pen circled totals, made notes in the margins. Every so often, he paused, not out of confusion, but out of disbelief. Then he found it. Harold S., a regular, veteran, just like him, had ordered a chicken basket last Thursday. The receipt showed two, but Harold always ordered one. Always. Walter didn't flinch. He folded the receipt slowly, neatly, the way someone folds a flag. He tucked it into the front pocket of his shirt and leaned back in the wooden chair. It wasn't just about the chicken basket. It was about a crack forming in the foundation he'd spent his life building. He sat there a while longer, alone, the hum of the refrigerator in the next room his only company. Then footsteps. Lisa. She stepped into the room, paused when she saw him sitting in the half-light. She held something in her hands, maybe a towel, maybe nothing at all. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Walter didn't look up. She stood for a second longer, then turned to go, but just before the door closed behind her, she hesitated, for one breath, looked back, then walked on, and in that small pause, something trembled loose, not quite a confession, not quite an apology, but maybe the beginning of both. The morning after the meeting arrived with brittle sunlight and a hush that didn't belong in a place that usually smelled of scrambled eggs and stories shared over coffee. Riverside Diner had always opened early, its regulars trailing in with newspapers folded under one arm and familiar nods offered without needing words. But today, the air inside felt taut, like something was waiting to land. Walter stood behind the swinging kitchen door, sleeves rolled up, hands steady on the prep counter. He hadn't said a word since unlocking the front door. The silence didn't bother him. It gave him space to think. And more importantly, space to listen. Lisa moved about the diner with her usual quiet efficiency, but even she couldn't hide the quick glances she tossed toward the front window. Megan and Tori chatted in low tones at the register, their laughter thinner than usual, as if they were waiting for the punchline of a joke that might not land right. Then the door opened, and a small bell gave its usual chime. Harold shuffled in, his steps deliberate, his breath slightly visible in the cold air he brought with him. He wore the same wool coat as last time and a maroon knit cap pulled low. In his hand, crumpled slightly from the clutch of age, was a white paper receipt. Lisa moved toward him. "Did you forget something yesterday, Mr. Harold?" Harold didn't smile. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the receipt. "No, dear, I brought something back." That sentence hung oddly in the air. Lisa paused, puzzled. "I was looking at this last night," Harold continued, unfolding the slip of paper like it was sacred. And I noticed, I was charged for 2 chicken baskets. But I only had 1. I remember, because I can't eat that much anymore. Doctor's orders. Behind the counter, Megan and Tori froze. Their hands paused mid-task. For a second, only the drip of the coffee pot could be heard. Walter stepped out from the kitchen just then, wiping his hands on a towel. He didn't rush, just moved the way he always had, calm, grounded, carrying more weight than anyone realized. He saw Harold, saw the receipt, saw the faces, and he knew. He didn't ask how. He didn't need to. "Thank you," Walter said quietly, stepping forward to take the receipt. "For coming back." Harold shrugged, almost apologetically. "I'm not trying to get anyone in trouble. Just, it didn't feel right. Is all." Walter nodded, his voice low. "That matters. Because it did. Not the few extra dollars. Not the food. But the truth. The fact that someone noticed. That someone cared enough to say it out loud." Lisa stood nearby, hands clasped tightly. Her face was unreadable, but something inside her shifted. A crack, maybe. A tremor of conscience finally allowed room to move. After Harold left, Walter returned to the kitchen, the receipt still warm in his palm. He placed it on the counter gently, almost ceremonially. Megan and Tori retreated into routine, refilling sugar jars, avoiding each other's eyes. But Lisa moved differently. She stepped into the small break room, pulled her old notebook from her bag, a habit she'd never dropped even as the world digitized. She flipped through pages worn soft at the edges, then stopped, tore one out carefully, wrote slowly, as if the words themselves might break if rushed. "I've seen them do it. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner." She folded it in thirds, slid it into an envelope she found near the register. On the front, she simply wrote, "Walter." Then she walked into the kitchen, where he'd left his mug beside the sink, and tucked the envelope under it. No one saw her. She wasn't looking for that. Later that evening, after the last customer left and the chairs had been flipped onto the tables, Walter found the envelope. He opened it without hurry. Read it once, then again. He didn't move for a long time. Eventually, he leaned back against the counter, eyes closed, the silence wrapping around him not as a weight, but as a reprieve. For the first time in days, the world didn't feel so far gone. It was a small note, a few words on a torn page. But sometimes, the smallest things are the first to break through the dark. It started with a single line of text. Not a phone call, not a confrontation, just a short message entered quietly on the community portal of Dayton's local governance site. Under the tab labeled, "Business Conduct Concerns," Harold had typed, "Charged twice for 1 meal at Riverside Diner." Probably a mistake, just wanted someone to know. No one would have thought much of it, except for the person who received it. Raymond Ellis had been sitting in his second-hand office chair, sipping weak tea, when the message popped up on his screen. The name, Harold S., didn't strike him, but the mention of Riverside Diner did. And more than that, the reply to email listed, "Walter Jennings at." He froze. Raymond hadn't seen Walter in years, not since the final memorial for their old Army unit. Back then, Walter still wore his grief like a well-pressed suit, still smiled too softly, still walked like someone carrying things no one could see. Raymond didn't schedule a visit. He didn't call ahead. Instead, he buttoned his best jacket and drove over, windshield wipers dragging across early afternoon drizzle. When he entered the diner, he didn't say much, just nodded to the hostess, requested a booth, and waited until Walter emerged from the back, apron folded under one arm. The moment their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Raymond didn't need to raise his voice. Walter didn't need to ask why he was there. "Coffee?" Walter offered. "Black," Raymond said, "like the good old days." They sat across from each other at a booth near the window, a plate of untouched cornbread between them. "I got a message," Raymond said after the pleasantries were out of the way. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "Someone reported a discrepancy on a bill. Said it happened here." Attached a photo of the receipt. Walter looked down at his hands. They were steady, but his knuckles were pale from how hard he was gripping the edge of the table. "I know," he said, quietly. Raymond nodded. "I figured you did. That's the problem, Walt. I know who you are. I know what kind of man you've always been. Which is why I need to say this. I can't ignore it. Not because I want to hurt you, but because I respect you too much not to. Walter didn't reply. He just looked out the window for a long moment, watching the wind move the branches of the elm across the street. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the table between them. Raymond didn't open it. I'm not here as the city, he said. I'm here as someone who once shared a trench with you. But even back then, we knew, truth matters. Even when it's messy. Before either of them could say more, Lisa's voice rose from across the dining area. I wrote the note. The entire diner seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Megan stopped mid-step at the counter. Tori lowered a tray of condiments. Sammy froze halfway between two orders. I wrote it, Lisa repeated, voice shaking but steady. The letter Walter found. I saw things. I didn't want to get involved. But I can't stay quiet anymore. She looked at Walter, her eyes wide with something between guilt and relief. I'm sorry. Megan laughed, a quick, nervous sound. This is all a big misunderstanding. Right? I mean, customers forget things all the time. If someone has a receipt, let's just see it. Walter stood. Slowly, he walked to the counter, reached into the drawer, and placed the envelope Raymond had seen on the table, letting it rest with finality. No one's forgetting anything, he said, voice low but unmistakable. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a pattern. And this, he tapped the envelope, is proof. Sammy, who had been silent the entire time, walked toward the hook near the kitchen door. He untied his apron with the kind of careful slowness that felt ceremonial. Then looped it over the hook like laying down something heavier than cloth. I should have said something sooner, he murmured, eyes on the floor. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was thick, charged with shame, confusion, and the distant sound of hope, clawing its way back into the room. Raymond stood. He looked at no one but Walter. You know what comes next, he said, his voice not unkind. It's time to choose, Walt, justice, or the comfort of pretending nothing ever happened. Walter didn't answer, not right away. But something in his shoulders, something that had been coiled for days, began to unwind. He looked around at the people who had stood beside him, who had failed him, and those who had quietly begun to rise. The choice wasn't easy, but some truths are heavier than silence. The morning felt off before the first key turned in the lock. Riverside Diner, usually humming with early chatter and the scent of fresh bacon by 7 a.m., sat still under a dull gray sky. A paper sign taped to the glass door read, "Closed for internal maintenance." But everyone inside knew that wasn't the truth. The chairs weren't stacked, the kitchen was spotless, and the only maintenance happening was of a different kind, the kind that scraped at trust, peeled back pleasantries, and forced people to look each other in the eye without blinking. The staff gathered at the main dining area, seated at the tables where customers usually sipped coffee and talked about the weather. Now, the air tasted heavier. Lisa sat with her hands folded tight, knuckles white. Sammy leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring at nothing in particular. Megan and Tori sat together, the space between them noticeably colder than usual. Raymond stood near the coffee counter, not as a friend now, but in the formal jacket of his office, a man representing something bigger than personal history. Walter entered last. No apron, no clipboard. Just a worn leather folder in one hand in the same expression he wore during the hardest weeks of his marriage, the weeks filled with hospital rooms and whispered prayers. He nodded once, and everyone quieted. I didn't want it to come to this, he said softly, placing the folder on the counter and opening it. He didn't look up as he spoke. But sometimes, silence does more damage than noise ever could. He began showing the records. The double-charged meals, the irregularities in cash entries, Lisa's handwritten note, Harold's receipt. I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to say what I know. Megan sat straighter, arms crossed. This could be a mistake. Old systems glitch all the time. You can't just assume. Raymond raised a hand. If I were to request full footage from last week, every shift, every register tap, would you have anything to be concerned about? The room held its breath. Megan's eyes flicked to Tori, then to the door, then to Walter. She stood. That's not fair. You're turning this into a witch hunt. But her voice had shifted. Not loud enough to be confident. not quiet enough to be remorseful. Walter didn't answer. He simply placed the folder beside a worn coffee mug, the one Evelyn used to insist stayed on the counter. No matter what. Then Lisa rose. Slowly. She didn't look at Megan. She looked at Walter. I remember you giving a free meal to a man who hadn't bathed in days. She said. You didn't even ask his name. You just said, no one leaves here hungry. I was proud to work here back then. Her voice cracked. Lately, I'm not so sure anymore. Sammy cleared his throat. 3 times. He said, that I know of, maybe more. I saw it happen. But I kept my head down. Rent's high. My wife's health isn't great. I told myself it wasn't my place. The room held a different kind of silence now, one filled with shame and something that sounded like the faint rhythm of redemption. Walter finally spoke again. I never opened this place to make a fortune. Evelyn and we just wanted one thing. A space where people could trust the hands that served them. That's all. He looked at Megan. Then Tori. I don't want anyone to suffer. But trust, once it's broken, it doesn't fix itself. Raymond stepped forward. Then it's decided, he said. Megan, you'll be placed on administrative leave pending further review. Tori, you may stay, if Walter agrees. Tori's eyes filled. I didn't say anything, she whispered. But I didn't do anything. Either. I'm sorry. Walter didn't respond immediately. He studied her face, not to measure guilt, but to search for sincerity. And then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, as the group began to disperse. Shoes scuffing the linoleum, voices low. Raymond lingered behind. The others passed around him like wind over a rock. He turned to Walter, pulling a memory from years gone by. You know, he said, Evelyn once told me something. Back when we were both too young to know how wise she was. Walter raised his brow. Curious. She said, Walter keeps his promises, even when no one else is watching. He paused. And today, I saw she was right. Walter didn't reply. He just looked down at the worn ring on his finger. Thumb brushing the edge. Sometimes, honoring a promise didn't look like standing tall. Sometimes, it looked like simply not sitting down when the truth needed someone to speak. The town of Dayton wasn't known for drama. People talked more about the price of gas and the weather than they did about scandal. But when something meaningful stirred beneath the surface, something rooted in principle rather than spectacle, it traveled differently. Not with the buzz of gossip, but with a quiet nod from one neighbor to another. That's how the news of what happened at Riverside Diner spread. Not many knew all the details. There were no viral videos, no angry tirades online, just conversations over grocery counters, whispered at Sunday service, or exchanged between rows of beans at the farmer's market. You hear about Walter? He did it the right way. Didn't he? Didn't raise his voice, just stood his ground. Exactly 1 week later, the Dayton Courier ran a small article on page 6. It didn't shout in bold headlines. Just a modest title in serif font. A business owner keeps his promise. In the piece, Harold Stanton, the soft-spoken man with the wool cap and slow gait, shared his story, not just of being overcharged for a chicken basket, but of something deeper. I served under Walter Jennings in Nam. The article read, there was a night I hadn't eaten in 2 days. We were pinned down, and morale was low. Walter handed me a piece of bread he'd been saving. Never said a word, just placed it in my hand. 40 years later, I walked into a diner and saw the same man, same silence. Same eyes. I paid for a meal I didn't receive. But I came back, not for the money. For the truth. Walter didn't know about the article until Lisa clipped it and left it on the counter next to his coffee mug. He read it alone, before sunrise, with the soft hum of the refrigerator as background music. He folded it carefully, tucked it into the drawer with Evelyn's handwritten menu, and didn't say a word. As for Megan, there was no court case. Walter didn't believe in dragging people through mud, but the restaurant group that managed Riverside's sister locations placed a quiet but firm ban on her re-employment. Actions, they decided, had their own way of circling back. Tori remained, though she no longer handled the register. By her own request, she moved into the kitchen to assist Sammy, slicing vegetables, washing trays, learning the rhythm of service without shortcuts. It feels better to earn something than to hide from it, she said one morning, unprompted. Sammy gave a quiet grunt of approval, which, in his language, meant more than any speech. Lisa was different too. For years, she'd taken the early shifts, kept her head down, delivered orders with a smile, and left before the dinner crowd rolled in. She had never asked for more responsibility, never hinted at wanting it. But now, Walter stood beside her one morning with a single brass key in his palm. "I need someone I can trust," he said simply, "for mornings, for the kind of work that happens before the sign flips to open." Lisa hesitated, eyes flickering from the key to his weathered face. "I don't want the key if I don't understand what it means." He didn't smile, he just closed her fingers gently around it. "You do now." And then there was Ellie. A wiry 10-year-old with curly hair and oversized glasses. She'd been coming to the diner every Saturday morning with her grandmother. She always ordered the same thing, pancakes, extra syrup, and drew pictures on the back of napkins while she waited. That week, she brought something different. A card made from construction paper, carefully folded, with stars drawn in crayon. It read, in uneven handwriting, "I want to grow up and own a diner like Mr. Walters, where people are kind, and nobody gets tricked." Walter found it tucked under the salt shaker. He stared at it for a long while, not because it was cute, but because it meant something had landed. Not just in her heart, but in the space between right and wrong that children seem to navigate with clearer eyes than most adults. Later that afternoon, he pinned the card on the community board, right below the old photo of Evelyn in her apron, holding the first Riverside Diner menu. He stood there for a moment, arms crossed, gaze soft, and for the first time in many years, when he smiled, he didn't feel the need to hide it. The morning broke quiet, the kind of quiet that only belongs to small towns before the world has stirred. Walter was already at Riverside Diner, well before the staff arrived. The front door unlocked but not open. The "closed" sign still facing out. The coffee machine hummed low, waiting, like it understood the importance of stillness before motion. In the far corner of the diner, behind a shelf most customers never noticed, stood a narrow bookcase. It was Evelyn's idea, not for show, not for style, just practicality. Recipes, order forms, a couple of old cookbooks. Walter hadn't touched that shelf in years. Not really. He dusted around it, occasionally stacked a misplaced napkin holder nearby, but never opened the blue binder that sat on the bottom shelf. Until now, the binder creaked as he opened it. Time had softened the cover, and a faint scent of rosemary lingered. Evelyn had loved that herb. On the final page, in her looping, careful script, was a note she'd written the year they opened the diner. "If you can't do something grand," it read, "then do something kind, but never turn away." Walter stared at the sentence until the words blurred. Not from age, from something else entirely. Behind him, the door jingled open. Lisa stepped inside, holding a small bouquet of fresh daisies, Evelyn's favorite. She placed them in the old milk bottle on the windowsill and turned to him. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "You ever think about passing this place on Sunday?" Walter didn't answer right away. He walked to the front window and looked out. Across the street, Ellie sat beside her grandmother at their usual booth by the window. The little girl was mid-story, hands moving with energy, maple syrup pooling on her plate. Her laughter was loud enough to cut through the glass. Walter smiled. Not the kind that pulls your face, but the kind that settles into your chest like a warm coat on a cold day. "I have," he finally said, voice low. Lisa didn't press. She just nodded, understanding that not every answer comes in full sentences. A little after 7, the first customer walked in. An elderly man Walter didn't recognize. Thin coat, rough hands, eyes that moved too slowly for someone who had slept well. He paused just inside the door, as if unsure whether he belonged. Walter didn't ask if he needed a table. He didn't ask if the man had cash. He just walked over to the counter, poured fresh coffee into a pale green ceramic mug, one of the last of Evelyn's set, and brought it to the man himself. "Sit anywhere," he said, placing the mug down. "It's cold out today." The man nodded once. No thanks. No story. Just a slight tremble in his fingers as he curled them around the cup. Walter returned to the counter, folded the towel in his hand, and exhaled. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need headlines. He needed that man to have a warm cup of coffee in his hands. That was enough. And maybe, just maybe, Evelyn was still there, somewhere in that steam rising slowly into the quiet air. Not in words, not in presence, but in the act itself. Because sometimes, silence wasn't defeat. Sometimes, silence was a promise kept, with yourself. And with the ones who trusted you to keep going. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with sirens or court orders. Sometimes, it comes in the form of an old man placing a cup of coffee in front of a stranger, no questions asked. No receipt needed. Walter didn't shout, didn't punish. He simply reminded everyone what decency looks like when no one's watching. And maybe, in a world that forgets too quickly, the quietest kind of integrity is the one that lingers the longest. If this story touched something in you, maybe a memory, a question, or even a quiet truth, please subscribe to Undercover Truths to walk with us through more untold journeys. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.